Hello, everyone. Welcome to Navigating the Complexity of Cybersecurity Compliance. I'm Tom Bray with Edge Consulting. A few weeks ago, we were looking at various topics that were trending and also through our client engagements. And what we saw is the first top 5 cybersecurity and risk management topics. So we just really felt passionate about covering off on cybersecurity compliance. We've also seen it in several of the reports, such as the Verizon report, where CISOs are really making this a part and has to be a part of their playbook. So it's part of the baseline. So we really appreciate you guys attending today and looking forward to a great session here with our subject matter experts. So let me go ahead and introduce our folks who are helping us today with this roundtable discussion. We've got Megan Whitfield. She comes to us with 20 years experience in cybersecurity consulting, navigating across various compliance frameworks such as NIST 853 and FedRAMP. She's been helping government agencies for many years navigate the complexity of cybersecurity compliance as well as enterprise organizations. She's very familiar with everybody having to work with spreadsheets and doing those crosswalk exercises. So I'm glad to have Megan here. She's also a published author. So today someone will walk away with one of her books. It is an Apple product, so you do have to have the Apple technology in order to use the book. We also have Nick Summers. He is the CEO and co-founder of Comply. It's an AI-driven company that's looking for driving those efficiencies in compliance across very, very complex government and global organizations that really have to go deep, and the complexities get pretty intense pretty quickly. He's been a cybersecurity consultant as well as a transformative IT leader across various consulting organizations such as KPMG, Accenture, Booz Allen, and Capgemini. Super happy to have Nick Summers here with us as his company is really using AI in a way that a lot of times the conversation is about kind of AI working against cybersecurity, but this is AI working for cybersecurity. So happy to have Nick with us. So, hey, I'll just go ahead and start us off in our roundtable discussion with our first question. And that is, what are most organizations' common cybersecurity compliance challenges that they face today? So I'll get us started off with Megan. If you would kick us off with, what are your thoughts on that?
Thank you for having me, Tom, and happy to join you and Nick today. Again, my name is Megan Whitfield, and my expertise is with NIST 853. I work with companies that pursue obtaining a FedRAMP and or state ramp authority to operate, an ATO. What I encounter frequently are organizations that do not understand the requirements specified in the controls, and many do not take the time to create a common control framework to understand where requirements from one framework overlap with a requirement with another framework or across multiple frameworks. If you have a consolidated view, you can see where your organization satisfies a requirement and where you have gaps. Next, you can develop a plan to remediate the gaps, and most importantly, you can create an evidence repository that will make data collection run smoothly during an audit. There is mapping available that shows alignment of major frameworks such as NIST 853, Rev 5 to GDPR, CCPA, SOC, HIPAA, HITRUST, ISO, and others. Much of this information is available for free on the internet, so there really is no need to not spend the time to see where you stand and where your requirements overlap with other frameworks.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Megan. Nick, do you have anything to add?
I agree with what Megan said. Is the familiarity with the lack of controls is a consistent issue. People do understand the framework, they'll get the standard, but they don't understand the difference between implementing and what's really required to satisfy the control. And as you get into the complexity of one control relying on another, that further complicates the problem that organizations encounter. We see it. So Megan's on the 853 side. We spent a lot of time in the 800-171 side with the new compliance framework that is required in the defense industrial base. But the problems are inherent because actually 171 is a child of what comes out of 853. So
Right.
many of what Megan sees at a much broader range, we see a little bit more distilled, but the problems and the challenges remain the same. And so which is where we took an approach from trying to get AI to take some of not only the complexity out of it, but then really be able to bring the data together so that as you're working with it, and then you have to produce your reports at the end that have your policies that say, hey, we met this, and as Megan referenced, the evidence to say that yes, we actually did satisfy that piece. That's where we had to leverage AI to be able to do that just more effectively, because it's in our industry, it just makes the process go a lot easier for companies, lowers the time and the cost, but enhances the efficiency.
Excellent. Yeah, excellent points there. Yeah, evidence gathering has always been a challenge, and also keeping that evidence fresh, also a challenge. So, yeah, good points. Appreciate that. So let's look at our next question. So you touched on it a little bit, but how do you align the organization's security policies with the complexity of these frameworks, especially the way you mentioned it, Nick, where they're kind of nested in some respects. But yeah, what are your thoughts there, Nick?
Well, there's a couple of ways. The standards, you have to keep in mind, the standards were developed, it's some time back, where technology has actually developed that takes beyond what spreadsheets offer you, which is really the common tool of the trade. That's your knife, or your Swiss Army knife. The challenges that we see a lot is that the policies, and this was another reason we developed this AI component, our platform, was everybody writes policies different. Nonetheless, the standard stays the same. And so there's interpretation that goes on to say, well, we think we met this, and this framework, and then our policies actually reflect that framework, where oftentimes once you get them audited, you find out there was quite a bit of a gap between your policy's comprehensiveness to address that control in a framework and then what they really meant. So there's a little bit of an interpretation gap that shows up typically in the policies, because that's what you hand off to get certified. That's what a 3PO or a C3PO in our case will look at. And so I think that's the companies often have very good security in place. Does it actually align to the framework is one question, but is that actually articulated in the policy that says, yes, we do that? And so those are some of the gaps that we try to help fill. And as I said, 853 that Megan works for is quite a bit more expansive. So the challenges that she helps overcome are going to be quite a bit more exacerbated than potentially what we see in our space.
Okay. Megan, anything to add to that?
And all I want to say is that I agree with Nick wholeheartedly. And I like to review the policies, and I would like to understand how they line up with the different frameworks. And then I like to conduct detailed gap assessments so that I know what controls have been met, where are there gaps within that control, and where are there gaps in other controls, and then have a comprehensive view of what the picture really looks like on what's met, where are my gaps, and then I like to prioritize them based on what are my show-stopping, high, critical, medium, and low controls, and then prioritize them, and then assign work to the team so that we can go ahead and hit the major controls first and then work our way down. But definitely, I fully agree with Nick. You've got to understand where you are with the controls. Did you meet the control, and where are your gaps? And you have to make sure that that documentation lines up, or you're going to get buried and you're going to fail an audit.
Gotcha. This is kind of a curveball question, but just a kind of a follow on is, what do you see when you're looking at the company's policies in terms of being up to date? There's a line between a standard and a policy. those kind of things. I think Nick introduced the topic that, it's a little challenging sometimes the way they're written because every organization does it a little bit differently. So some of your thoughts on what you've experienced from that perspective, policies and keeping them up to date and the content of those policies.
So for me, I find myself going into a situation where I'm having to shed light on the truth and re-educate clients and help them understand. I know this seems like it addresses the control, but it does not. And then you have to break down each element within the control and say, this is where you hit the mark. Yay, you get an A+ for that. But in this segment of the control, this was not addressed. And if you do not include this, you fail this with an audit.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, very good point. Let's go on to the next question. Can you give some examples of where poor compliance management has led to significant security breaches? I mean, it seems like we're getting so numb to security breaches because they're just happening at a rapid pace, and also the size of the breaches are also pretty big. So, and if anybody's seen Information is Beautiful, that bubble chart is just kind of amazing. It shows you the timeline and the bubble size based on how big the breach was. So anyhow, with that, Megan, what do you think?
I'm going to be honest. Thankfully, my experience with identifying compliance issues has been early on, so I've been able to help companies avoid breaches, fines, and major PR crisis. However, I go in and I'm looking for the show-stopping critical controls, the things that are going to cost you money or potentially land you in front of a legislative body, or could even possibly lead to jail, which is some things that we've seen some CISOs being indicted for withholding information. So I like to go in, I like to make sure you have FIPS 140-3 encryption. I like to go in and make sure that your mobile endpoints are secure. And I like to go in and make sure that you're avoiding information spillage and that you have a plan. If you take a look at all of the different breaches and incidences that we're having, someone has failed to meet the essence of the control. There's a tool that wasn't configured properly. There was something that was ignored, and hackers got in, breached their system, and corrupted their backup data and hosed them. And we've just seen that with a major healthcare company earlier this year that resulted in millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars of damage to them and all the companies that were connected to their systems.
Yeah, it's good points. Good points. Yeah. And I can see you did your homework on that one. So good job.
I lived through that one. I lived through that one.
Nick, what do you think?
So opposite from Megan's perspective, we've actually done work with one of the world's largest retailers that had a breach, and one of the world's largest food companies that also had a breach for different reasons. But one was actually held in hostage for their data, and it's just kind of a unique perspective. It's rarely one control that fails, rarely one thing that fails. It's a series of things that actually coalesced at a time where the exposure became much broader. Usually one or two things won't get you killed, but it's usually a systemic set of issues, because it's rare that a company doesn't have problems in more than one area of their policies. It's typically something systemic or a little bit wider across the organization. But we see different flavors of this happening, and I think what's becoming very pervasive right now, which is a little bit different than hacks and attacks in the past, is the use of third-party contractors to actually gain access into systems, where previously it was just really working on the perimeters or the people that were in the organization. And that's led to some really significant ones. You saw this at Caesars. You saw this at MGM. Two of them take different approaches to how they were going to deal with this. One paid the ransom for $15 million and got back about 55% of their data. One of them didn't pay the ransom and were held a little bit longer, but lost $1 billion in market share. And so there are different approaches to how they were going to deal with this. But when we go in and we do this hostage work, we find out that it was many, many different places along the chain, but it was one little thing that actually let them in the door, which is fine. It's the issue of being able to then just run through, and that typically shows up in ultimately those things will show up at the end of the day somewhere in your policies. You just it wasn't recorded, and as Megan said, there's a lot of withholding from within the organization that because liability becomes imposed.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. Where do you see regulatory organizations as far as, I think back to when HIPAA first came out, and there was no real entity, there was no real manpower to actually do enforcement.
Yeah.
And compare that to today's landscape, FTC enforcement and other type of enforcement agencies. What are your thoughts on where we sit today relative to that, like manpower and actually having repercussions for being,
Sure.
non-compliant?
Yeah, in two aspects of this. The first is in our space in the defense industrial base, and we do work on both sides of the fence, on the commercial side, and then a lot of it primarily in the DIB nowadays, because that's where we're seeing the greatest, a significant uptick in the exfiltration of our national securities. What we see is the way that the enforcement's becoming, and I think it's a brilliant way that they're doing this. Most of the companies that are in the space are both public and private, or both public facing, so they do work for the government, but they also do work private and commercial. And so in order to, they've been more focused on enforcement from the defense side, granted, but then they've partnered up with the FTC, and they're saying, okay, even if you're doing defense work, but you're a public company, we're going to find you on the other side. So they're really just putting the clamps on companies from both sides, which they should be doing, because a company's a company, whether one's the defense side and one's the commercial side, they're still an organization. And so you'll find those same problems of compliance on both sides. And I think it's great. In our space specifically, the DoD has set out a group of people that is basically a police force for enforcing compliance in the DIB. And they show up and at your doorstep and audit you on the spot, just like they were the IRS. And that's put a little bit of fear, which is forcing a better degree of compliance. I think there's a lot of lackadaisicalness. Oh, the chances of this happening to us are remote. It's nowhere near as remote as you think it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's everybody.
Okay.
Yeah, it's most people are in some degree of non-compliance. It's, people like Megan and in our companies really go out and help find that for you before it becomes a problem that it could be catastrophic to your organization.
And just to kind of piggyback on what Nick is saying, we see government agencies having detailed requirements for FedRAMP, CMMC, and other frameworks. But it's only a matter of time before the government is going to start requiring this for commercial, private sector, and nonprofit organizations. We've been fortunate enough that we survived the colonial gas pipeline hack. We are surviving the breach of Optum's, of United Care's Optum Change Health organization. But these hackers are becoming more and more sophisticated, and they're breaching more systems. And I agree with Nick, there's a lot of things that are flying under the radar that are not being reported, although the Biden administration signed an executive order mandating that everyone will report their breaches. People are not doing that. So we're literally a stone step away for these strict requirements to be imposed on everyone, not just if your organization is doing business with the federal government, but if you're doing business that impact people's lives, whether it's high, medium, or low, commercial, nonprofit, private sector, we're going to see strict enforcements placed on them. And a lot of those companies are not going to be in position and prepared for what's coming.
Yeah. The landscape is changing quickly, and
Yes,
the regulatory landscape along with it. So yeah, all very good points. Okay, let's go to our next question. So how often should organizations perform compliance audits, and what should they focus on during these reviews?
Megan, you want to start?
I will take that one. Audits should be performed at least annually. Can you hear my FedRAMP and state ramp speak coming out? As well as as well as in the event of a security incident or breach. Now, let me stress something. It's also a good idea to perform health checks, especially if another company has an incident. If you are connected to a company that has experienced an incident, and if a company that is part of your supply chain has experienced an incident, it is also important to conduct health checks and or audits when there have been changes to laws, executive orders, directives, regulations, or anything that your company is required to comply with. And that last statement, that is the one most organizations miss. They will meet everything with the control, but when it comes to making sure they are up to date with current rules and regulations that they're required to adhere to, they miss that one, and therefore they get downgraded and they have a gap and they have to fix that or else they're not passing their audit.
Good. Yeah. Nick, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. Megan and I are obviously looking on the same page on this, because that's really the focus of how the industry needs to be approached. And our requirements in our space in the DIB are, and most companies that are regulated, you have to understand the regulated companies will see this with a bit more stringency than non-regulated. At minimum, you should be doing annuals, right? In our space, it's required, an annual checkup is required, and then every 3 years you get certification again. But the problem is most companies treat this as an exam. I just have to pass my finals and then I'm done for the year and I'll just take my exams next year. And this approach has shown itself to be absolutely detrimental to the organizations. We try to encourage now, and we work with companies to keep a continuous compliance, and particularly because a lot of the work we do is focused in the supply chain and IT systems talking to each other. And as a result of that, IT systems are forever changing. And one of these changes automatically, and people don't recognize this, will move you out of compliance. So without that continuous awareness, which is it's not complicated to do, just companies look at it as a burden as opposed to this keeps us in business. And those are, different trade-offs. So the minimum time you should be doing this is when you have to do it and when you should be doing it. These are two different things. You should be doing this all the time. When you have to do it, obviously that's for your accreditations and for your certifications. But I think that's probably one of the bigger problems is it's treated as an annual exam versus this should be part of the DNA of your company. This is where you lose your business, and where people start going to jail. Because just making it reference, the enforcement criteria in our business now are required jail time. And that's significantly different than what was in the past where you got fined and everybody went back to work. The DOD and government agencies and the public in general, the FCC now, they've had enough of it. There has to be better penalties to get compliance because companies just aren't willingly doing this.
Agree.
Great. Yeah, I think one of the takeaways there was that part about it seems like a secondary or tertiary thought on the monitoring and the continuous compliance monitoring. Just seems to be one of the things that either isn't done or it's a second thought, and so it's maybe not done as precise as you might expect.
Yeah.
Great. All right. Let's go to our next question. How can organizations manage third-party risk to ensure vendor compliance with cybersecurity standards? I think we saw this kind of come into the fold during the Target breach where the HVAC vendor came in. And so it's been several years. There's been several, I think, maturity in that space. What do you guys think? We'll go with Nick first.
We deal a lot with the supply chain. That's typically where you'll see a breach is information sharing or data sharing between companies, or I gave somebody from one of my suppliers access to our system so they could collaborate more closely with our teams. We look at the supply chain is full of this. It's just every step down from the prime or from the actual business itself creates another challenge, and nobody's really doing compliance the same way. That's the other challenge. There's not consistency to say, hey, you should be doing compliance the way we are because we're doing it very well. And vendors are notorious for that because you're trying to get vendors paid as quickly as possible. You're trying to get supplies from them. So that tends to be a little bit looser because there's a lot of capital flowing through those systems in theory. But that's also where the majority of breaches are showing up. As we were saying, the Capital One breach was a vendor that occurred. Most of the breaches we're seeing nowadays are actually on third parties because they're the easiest targets to get into where you want to go. And I think that's, as they're releasing these new standards, it's now focused on end to end. The person who owns the deal is now responsible for everybody down the chain. And I think that's a great way to do it because it puts liability on everybody. And without doing that, it's hard to enforce it. So I think they're looking more closely at how are we sharing with our partners in order to deal with the third-party compliance. But that's also where the majority of the risk we're seeing is.
Yeah, I think that's all good points. One of the things that comes to mind is the various manifestations of the third parties. And what I mean by that is like API integrations that organizations might not even know that they have. Like your compliance team might not know about it, because maybe it's through your networking team or your application teams where they're putting these APIs in place. And maybe they have a standard, but again, accounting for those is sort of like an inventory checklist item. Megan, what are your thoughts?
Okay, so this is one of the control families that I get on my soapbox about, and I basically go there. The supply chain control family was added to NIST 853 and Rev 5, and we went from 17 to 18 control families, and this control family was added. And basically, I can't stress it enough. Organizations must have a supply chain risk management plan. It's got to detail your supply chain risk. You've got to mitigate and understand for the known and what could possibly happen. You've got to have a supply chain risk management team that's monitoring the activities. You've got to have processes and procedures so that you can identify gaps and weaknesses and quickly move to rectify them. You've got to employ the right controls to protect against supply chain risk in your system. And most importantly, based on the recent events that we've seen in the Middle East, we must all understand the importance of implementing a tamper protection program to detect and prevent counterfeit and other components from entering the supply chain. Who knew wearing a pager on your hip could be deadly?
Wow.
Need I say more?
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing. Yeah. Good point. Good point. Yeah, that's a good thing too with the 853. I was not familiar with that. So that's interesting. So playing a little catch up. I mean, it's been a thing, but that's kind of to be expected from the regulators is trying to play catch up.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's see. Let's go to our next question. How can organizations ensure that its access control mechanisms are fully compliant? Let's go with Megan.
Another soapbox topic for me that I'm screaming from the rafters on. Organizations must understand the requirements and properly configure tools for effective monitoring and tracking. If you're not doing that, you're basically opening up the door to hackers. And more importantly, you must have sufficient personnel available 24/7 to monitor your systems, your system components, and your system services. There are so many people who will get part of that right and the other part wrong, and you're opening up the door for someone to come in and look around and find opportunities to breach your system and expose you.
In your travels, and like you just mentioned, 853 adding vendor, like how are companies keeping up with changes such as like, for years we had to worry about password changes. And then wasn't there something recently where now it's passwordless? And so we're kind of having to evolve to the regulation has to evolve to what do you do when it's passwordless and you have a requirement that says you have to change your password. So what are you saying in that regard?
Is that to me or to Nick?
Yeah, that's to you.
Okay, that's to me. Okay, perfect. I'm working with an organization right now that has a basic user ID and password for one of their components. And it's up to their client to change that user ID or their password. And of course, the moment that I heard that, I just literally fell to pieces and wanted to crawl up under the table, because you've got to have multi-factor authentication. You just can't have a set password that's written down on a piece of paper that someone can access. You've got to have more stringent access controls for your operation environment, for your external customers, for your vendors. You've got to have stricter mechanisms when it comes to your passwords. This is 2024. This is not 1984. We've got to be more methodical and more logical about how we're doing it, and how we are rotating, and how we're doing multi-factor authentication.
Nick, what's your thoughts on that?
I think what we're seeing a trend in now is, and this is really based on a lot of empirical data. People have access to too many files and systems across the organization. More than 40% of employees have access to things they should never have access to. We've been a part of studies that have looked at this, and what we would say about referencing to what Megan was saying earlier, is obviously the multiple levels of authentication is one thing, but you have to have these more distributed across the organization. You have to have them at your file control levels. You have to have them. We work with organizations because we spend a lot of time at the data level, where you cannot see elements in a data string because you don't have a permission to be able to do that. And the access control is one thing, but you have to look at the granularity of the permission. You want people to be able to get in and have your own people be able to have access to the resources they need. The problem is they have too much access. And companies are, because they think it's too complex to manage these in multiple places. But that becomes the problem, is you don't have enough gates, and you're just letting everybody into the pen. And without those in different places, it defeats the purpose of what they were designed to do. Access doesn't mean just access into the organization. You should have gates everywhere you walk along the path to ensure that the right access is provided, and better visibility. A lot of companies don't do regular hygiene on their Active Directory. That creates a tremendous problem within the organization. And so there's some simple ways to start, but I would just simply, for this purpose, I would say that there are more gates needed in different parts across the organization. It can't be just at these head ends where people come in. It has to be with what they do, where they're going, and then multiple levels of controls on that. MFA is a really good one. RSA keys is another very good one. So you want to combine some of these together as you get deeper into more sensitive data.
Okay. Yeah. I think, it's hard, right? We've been talking about this for a long time, and you hit it, with the visibility. How do you get the visibility so you can actually see? And the more complicated the environments, where you've got a mixture of on-premise and cloud, and you've got SaaS apps, it's like, how does it all come together? How do you get that visibility that you're looking for across all of those different technologies, and actually see, all that, where you have excessive access? So, yeah, well done. Yeah, good points made there. All right, let's go to our next question. What steps can organizations take to ensure that they have smooth audits and regulatory reviews? We'll stick with you, Nick.
Start early, and be open-minded. I think the biggest thing is they start later in the process is probably the first thing. Is that the second thing that we started this whole conversation off with at the very beginning was about the difference between understanding a policy, what it means, and then how that policy is reflected in an evidence. Regulatory reviews are evidence-based. You have to be able to show that we're doing this. This is how we're doing it, and we've documented both of those in our policies. The last thing I would say on this is the openness of the organization to recognize we're not doing something right, because God forbid should we find something we're not doing right, then we got to go back and fix it. Yes, welcome to regulation, but that's also the process for you to actually then take yourself out of the line of fire to remediate some of the risks that you have. That's what the whole point about this regulation is. is to try to remediate the risks that you're presenting, not only to your business, but also to the wider supply chain, so that contagion doesn't exist from one organization to the other. And so starting early is one thing. And understanding that if you don't understand what the policies truly mean and how to get your organization aligned to them, experts like Megan are, they can interpret. This is this language. The policies are one language, and what the controls are is another. And so there's really having interpreters say this is actually what the policy means, because I see this a lot of times. They don't pass their certifications because even though it was black and white and you understood the sentence, you didn't quite understand exactly what the policy was asking for. And that's where experts like Megan come into play. And what we work with is to be able to help you interpret that quickly, to say, no, this is actually what it meant. And so that you can have better assurity that you're going to pass.
Gotcha.
And what I would follow on and say is sitting down with an assessor can be a nerve-wracking and difficult experience. So prepare your team, conduct mock interviews, and get them comfortable demonstrating different aspects of their system and answering questions. And so the more preparation you can do once they sit down with the auditor, the more comfortable that they are, because you've prepped them and they're ready. They'll be able to just shoot out the answers like rapid fire and help you get through the audit and have a successful outcome.
Yeah, sometimes coming across as that with that confidence
That's
that you've got everything handled, and like you said, the evidence too that backs it up. So,
Megan, that's a great thing. I think that's probably one of the best things is, get used to being in front of an auditor. It's an assessor. Some people feel like they're sitting down at the police station getting interrogated for a serious crime, and they just freeze up, and
Yes.
it doesn't the auditor. And then it makes the auditor suspicious, like, well, man, maybe they don't know what they're talking about in the first place. And that sets a cascading set of events into motion, and you were actually innocent. I think that's probably, once you get the interpretation down, I think Megan's point is probably really where it focuses, because that's what they look for. If you're nervous in the assessment, it makes the assessors wonder, well, this might not be right.
It makes them very suspicious.
That does.
yes, that's a good point. Auditors, hey, we're here to help. Anyhow,
Yeah.
all right. Next question.
Sure.
6 words from the government. Yeah.
So what technology solutions make cybersecurity compliance more efficient and less burdensome? So we've talked, a couple of times about spreadsheets, manpower to actually get this work completed. Yeah, it's critical to your risk management, but it's a lot. And, so what are you seeing in the compliance landscape that can help with giving the folks that have this mission something that gives them some efficiencies? We'll go to Nick on that one. Let's go to Nick on that one.
Okay.
This is so I at the firms that I work for, the KPMG and EY, these are tax auditing firms, even though we have very big, robust cybersecurity practices. And they're spreadsheet driven and they're people driven. And that's time, and time is, there's a cost to time and there's an efficiency to time. In looking at that, that's how we left these larger firms and we leveraged AI for a lot of this work, because it's less tedious, it's fresh, you get consistent results. And I would say for anybody watching, it's not hard to adopt and write, to build some of these smaller pieces of let's say, we don't leverage AI for everything, but it serves a really great purpose when you're dealing with these data and trying to figure out how to get better views of your data and how your data aligns better to policies. That's really where we leverage it. I think the problem in our industry is there's so many tools that say they do compliance. And so you go and spend a bunch of money and a bunch of time, and then you figure out that really didn't do what we thought it was going to do. And then there's the other side where we hired a bunch of people to come in here and do that. And I have a lot of experience with this. And they brought 10,000 spreadsheets and we still didn't get the value of what we were looking. My advice would be, there's a great number of a lot of good things. Look at small pieces that you can deal with first. What's your key problems? If we don't have people, how can we automate the process? If we're not good at understanding or getting to data, how do we deal with the data piece? I would say don't look at it holistically. Take it in pieces, because it's easier to build on success from that perspective than to run out and spend a lot of money on platforms that ultimately weren't really going to solve the problem in the end. So start small and look at your biggest problems first and try to solve those. And if you can't do it manually, try to leverage little pieces of technology. That'd be my best advice for companies today.
Okay. Megan, what's your
I,
thoughts?
I totally agree with Nick. Make the investment in tools.
Yeah.
There's nothing worse than a group of people collaborating on a system security plan, overwrite data, or the system crashes, or I'm sorry, or the tool crashes because they don't have a document management system that can handle multiple users, do version control, doesn't crash, and can prevent data being overwritten. Because I'm in the FedRAMP state ramp world, there are a lot of companies who have come up with different accelerator programs. The best one that I've seen, I got introduced to about 3 weeks ago, and this company has a compliance accelerator program where they come in, review your system, talk with your team, and then they take their tool that they have and implement it in your environment. That scripting that pulls data from your system and puts it into an evidence repository, and then they sit with you when you're doing the audit and sit with you and your team to ensure that you have the evidence available and that you're getting through the audit, because auditors will look at your data and they'll start asking for some random things. So the more you can use automated tools, the more you can purchase and make an investment in automated tools in your environment, it's only going to make your life easier. And if you can't buy everything your first year, do what Nick said. Plan it out. Start small. Go with what's important. Make that investment your first year. Make another investment your second year, and another investment your third, fourth, and fifth year until you're able to build up and have all the components that you want to make your life and the lives of your team members a lot happier and a lot easier.
That's a good point. I'm thinking back to a spreadsheet that we had at one of the organizations I worked at, and yeah, just like copying the screenshot of the evidence into the spreadsheet. I was just like, I mean, but to your point, like if that's what you can do and you're focusing on, say, your most important systems, then, maybe that works for you for now. But yeah, that's not gonna help you as much as what you described, Megan, and what Nick described. Okay, so let's see here. I think we have a question. Here you go. Okay. Final thoughts and questions, but I see that we do have a question, and it's related to the discussion we were having about the third-party companies and how do you enforce cybersecurity with the third-party companies. So you could think about answering that maybe as the question is posed, like how can companies enforce cybersecurity with compliance with third-party companies they work with. So what do you think? I'll go with Megan on that one.
Well, you've got to flow down your FedRAMP and or state ramp requirements to your third-party vendors. And you have to be very prescriptive and tell them what thou shalt do, which is exactly what NIST 153 says. You've also have to come up with different checklists. You've got to set expectations and let them know what you're looking for. So you can give them the outline of what you're expecting to see in their supply chain risk management plan. You can send them a checklist and do a preliminary gap assessment to see where they are before you actually come in and do a formal assessment or a health check of their requirements. So give them the ideas, but set the expectations that because you are my vendor and I am held to these strict standards, I'm going to hold you to these standards as well. But partner with them and help them to understand what those requirements are, what you're expecting, and definitely do some hand holding and give them some guidance so that everyone can win together instead of losing together.
Good. Yeah. Nick, what do you think?
Agree completely with Megan. Flow it down. You have to hold your vendors to the same standard that you're being held to, or then you're just exposing yourself to a lot of risk. hand them, and we do this, the companies we work with hand them the same set of documents that are required for access and say, you have to do this if you want to work with us. They have they're your vendor. They're not, they're somebody that you're doing business with, and you have to take that position with them, and vendors will push back. You're gonna say, oh, this is too much for us. This is too much for us. They will comply. If it means that they're not going to be able to do business, they will get on board. And but I think her point is extremely valid. Flow it down, give them a list so you show them exactly what you're expecting of them, and then go validate, audit them, and make sure that they actually are doing that, because them giving you back a spreadsheet and saying, hey, we did this, here you go, is not the same as you saying, we need to see this. We actually, our security team needs to look at this and make sure that's the case. That's probably one of the best protections you have.
What are your thoughts on, like, because you were talking about priorities, but basically rating your third-party companies, basically from a risk perspective. So as an example, like your first tier third parties might be those that store and process or have access to your systems, or they have APIs. What are your thoughts along those lines, in your approach?
Yeah, we have a different set of recommendations for how to deal with this, in that we have companies that we work with that do a lot of vendor work. They're a significant part of the supply chain. We actually have them enclave off systems so that vendors come into one set of systems, but that's all they can touch. And even then, it's not the actual system itself. It's a replication of the actual system, so that they're not able to go anywhere else in the organization. They can see the data they want, but it's basically in a locked room with one door, and that door only faces them. And that's where you cut down a tremendous amount of access, because once someone is in one system, is connected to another system, and if they're diligent, they'll get into that next system. But what you do is, by creating an enclave for your vendors and just saying this is only an external facing network, all we can do is push data into it, but no one can come internally from that network. Enclaving is one of the best ways. You have copy more data, but that's your best option, is to contain the vendors.
I would wholeheartedly agree. And what I tell companies that I work with is treat them the way you're being treated. When you have an agency that's working with you to give you a provisional ATO and then sponsor you before the FedRAMP PMO, they want your show-stopping high and critical controls addressed. There are some medium and low controls that they're willing to allow you to do a plan of action and milestones, a POAM, where you come up with a plan for those. Do that with your vendors as well. Treat them the way you're being treated, and hold them to the same expectations that you're being held accountable for, and then manage that POAM and make sure that what they said they were going to do by a certain time, that you're monitoring, that you're tracking, you're getting regular status reports. And if they're meeting the requirements and the timeline, great. But if they start to fail it, then you've got to take a look at that relationship and see if they're not meeting the muster, then maybe they need to be replaced by someone else, because that's exactly what a federal agency is going to do with you.
Yeah. I'm looking here. We have one more question. I think we have time for one more. And this comes here. What tools/apps are you using to make cybersecurity compliance more efficient? And as I read that question, I'm thinking about a time when I worked at a company, a global enterprise, a data company, and we were using Archer. And I just remember trying to upload some of these CSV files from audits and having an error, and then having to do research on how to, like, the error codes were not good. So anyhow, what are your thoughts today? Because that was like probably late 1990s. Today, what tools, apps are you seeing that make cybersecurity compliance more efficient? Like, I'll go to Nick with that one.
I think it depends on your approach. Some companies look at this from a perimeter perspective, people getting in, but then you have to think a bit more thoroughly about what the problem is. And so if you're solving a perimeter problem, that's one thing. There's everything from CrowdStrike to there's a million of them, Defender. Pick your choice. The fundamental challenge is they're coming in to get data. And so you have to, if you look at this from the other perspective, which is how we advise our clients, and we have a tremendous track record for doing this, is we help them fix their data problem, because ultimately hackers aren't coming in to steal a server. They're not going to walk out the door with the server. It's what's on these servers that they're interested in. It's what's in your data stores that they're interested in. And so if you take the data approach, which is how we tend to look at the world, it's a data first approach. We use tools, and some of these are enterprise grade tools, but the functionality is what I want to convey to you, because there's a lot of different tools out there that you can use. There's companies like Big ID, there's companies like Varonis, there's companies like Concentric that leverage the ability to not only make sure they can find, because that's one of the big problems. You don't know where all your sensitive data is, or your important data, but then be able to transform that data. So I can actually give you what would simply be, you would think it was sensitive data, but it's actually called synthetic data. And so you get to see what you need to see, but I can protect what I need to protect. And so I would say it would really depend which tools you're going to use on your approach. If you have a front door problem, obviously get a lock for your front door. If you have a problem that's inside of your organization, it's generally going to be related to data. But I've yet to meet a threat vector that was really just interested in your servers. They're not interested in your networks, but the servers and the network is what gets them to your data. And that's what they're after. Once you fix the data problem, then it lessens the load on the other problems that you have. So you may have an access problem, but once they get a hold of your data, it doesn't matter. It's unusable to them. Now it's going to upset them, and they may do something with your systems, but at the end of the day, you're not liable for a data breach, because even though they got your data, the data was absolutely useless. And that avoids a lot of the penalties that you're going to see.
Megan, any last thoughts?
I'm in the FedRAMP world, and I'm working mostly with organizations that are pursuing FedRAMP High, and that's 410 controls. So if I can leverage other solutions that are FedRAMP authorized, pull out the checkbook, make the purchase and acquire them, configure as they've recommended, so that I can inherit that control basically from them. That's helping me to work down my list of 410 controls. So for me, it's not just one solution. I'm going through what's in the marketplace that's authorized, and how can I leverage it? One, to make sure that I am securing my system based on what someone who already has that authorization is doing, and two, so I can work down that list of controls and try and make my life a little bit easier.
Great.
Tom, let me add one point to what Megan's saying, because I think this is pretty valuable for those that are still here. There's really three things you're going to be dealing with in this compliance space. It's going to be the data, the systems the data travels on. Those are two. And the third is going to be your policies, because what happens on your data side is what travels over your system ultimately gets reflected in your policies. And so as you're interpreting the policies, take the approach of, and this goes to what Megan said about inheriting controls. If you fix certain problems downstream, it alleviates the need to have that control. You can say, okay, that control doesn't apply because we don't do that. So cleaning up inside of your house first before it may loosen or lessen the number of controls. And believe me, that 410, we only have 320 on our side, but that 410, it's a process, and you have to get every one of them right. So look at ways not only to inherit controls, that's a great strategy, like using GCC High. It covers one of the cloud services. It takes that number down. But then also look at ways that you can do things internally. That means that control doesn't apply to me because we don't do it, or we do it in such a way that it alleviates the control itself. So there's a couple of ways to lessen the burden.
Gotcha. No, good point. Okay, with that, I think we're going to wrap it up. Just a reminder, somebody will be getting Megan's book for free. We also have this on demand. So if you have colleagues and coworkers or friends that would be interested, we're going to encourage you to take advantage of that on demand. You'll probably be getting a couple of emails too. We've got our article that's going to cover what we covered today. We've got a Q&A session as well. So you'll get a Q&A document that'll also be available on the Edge website. So really, thanks to everyone for joining us. Thanks to our subject matter experts. Excellent discussion. Compliance can sometimes be a dry topic, but I think you guys made it more energetic than most people maybe were expecting. As I've said to you guys before, I always joke about that old commercial for accounting. We're putting the fun back into compliance is kind of a tricky way to think about it. So yeah, if you could put the fun into it, that would be great. So thanks so much, everybody. And we'll see you on the on-demand session. Thanks.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.